One word from Dean Martin to Sammy Davis Jr., how it changed Hollywood forever. It was a moment that could have shattered friendships, careers, and the very foundation of the Rat Pack. Sammy Davis Jr., facing racial prejudice even in Hollywood, stood on the edge of despair. But then, Dean Martin spoke a single word. The word changed everything. What was that word? And how did it alter Hollywood forever? Where are you watching from? Hollywood in the 1960s was a world where power and privilege reigned supreme. But beneath the glitter and glamour, the cracks in the system were widening. Sammy Davis Jr., the charismatic performer, faced the full brunt of the entertainment industry's racism. He had earned his place as a Rat Pack member, but still, there were limits. His talent was undeniable, but the color of his skin made him an outsider in a world that wasn't quite ready to accept him. Dean Martin, the charming crooner and comedian, was always by Sammy's side, but the silent prejudice in the industry loomed over them both. Sammy often found himself wondering if his hard work would ever be enough to make him more than just a novelty act. Yet, despite the barriers, he kept pushing forward. For Sammy, there was no choice. He had a gift, and he intended to use it. But the tensions were rising. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either break him or solidify his place in history. How far could a man go before he cracked under the weight of the world? Sammy Davis Jr.'s journey was one marked by both brilliance and pain. From a young age, he was thrust into the harsh realities of a segregated world. His father, a vaudeville dancer, and his mother, a nightclub singer, gave him the tools to survive, but the world was never kind to him. He started his career in the clubs, performing for audiences that tolerated him but never truly accepted him. Hollywood, with its glamorous veneer, was no different. Sammy's first break came when he joined the Wilmaston Trio, a group that played in the shadows of the big stars. But he was more than just an entertainer. He was a fighter, determined to prove himself. It was his work ethic and undeniable talent that caught the eye of Frank Sinatra, who became a close friend and mentor. But even with Sinatra's backing, Hollywood kept its distance. Sammy's rise to stardom was not just about talent. It was a defiant act of perseverance in a world that didn't want him. Every performance, every note he sang, was a battle, against the industry, against the prejudice, and against his own fears of never being enough. But deep down, Sammy knew he had something the world couldn't ignore. And he wasn't going to let them forget it. As Sammy Davis Jr. navigated the challenges of fame and racism, the pressure started to mount. He had climbed so high, yet the industry still kept him at arm's length. His success was constantly overshadowed by the fact that he was black in a predominantly white world. The public's affection for him never fully erased the cold stares from his peers, and the feeling of being an outsider lingered even among his closest friends. The strain began to show. Sammy felt the weight of his position, constantly questioning whether his success had truly earned him the respect he deserved, or if it was simply the result of tokenism. Every night, after the applause faded, he wondered if he would ever be seen as an equal. It was a pain that never ceased, and it was compounded by the knowledge that the Rat Pack, his closest allies, had more power in Hollywood than he did. Dean Martin, his trusted friend, seemed to exist in a different world, one where prejudice didn't follow him like a shadow. Sammy couldn't help but wonder if the bonds they shared were enough to overcome the racial divide that separated them. The inner turmoil was growing, and Sammy had reached a breaking point. He couldn't pretend it didn't hurt anymore. Dean Martin was no stranger to the pressures of Hollywood, but he had navigated them in a way Sammy never could. His charm, wit, and impeccable timing made him one of the industry's darlings. He could move through the rooms of elite Hollywood circles without a care in the world, effortlessly winning the affection of everyone he met. But behind the humor and the smooth facade, Dean carried a deep sense of loyalty. He was the kind of man who protected his friends, who stood by those he cared about. Yet even he had his limits. He couldn't fully understand what Sammy was going through, but he tried. They had shared stages, laughter, and countless nights of camaraderie, but the unspoken truth between them was always there. Sammy's battles were far more difficult than Dean's. Sammy wasn't just fighting for fame, he was fighting for equality, for recognition as a human being, not just as a spectacle. Dean wanted to help, but how could he? Sammy had everything on his shoulders. Dean's loyalty was never in question, but he found himself questioning whether it was enough. Could one word from him make a difference in a world that had always seen Sammy as less than? That moment would come soon, and Dean would have to choose whether to stand by his friend or remain silent. It was a typical night at the Sands Hotel, the Rat Pack's favorite playground. Sammy, Frank, Dean, and the others were performing, the spotlight shining bright on them. But behind the scenes, the tension had reached its breaking point. Sammy had been met with yet another round of cold shoulders, and it was clear that the industry had drawn its line. He was being excluded from certain deals, certain projects, and despite his incredible talent, he was still treated as an outsider. The night's performance had been a success, but the sting of rejection lingered. Sammy retreated backstage, feeling the weight of the world pressing against him. Dean, who had noticed his friend's somber demeanor, made his way over. He found Sammy sitting alone, his hands resting on his lap, his face a mask of exhaustion. There was a quiet desperation in Sammy's eyes that Dean couldn't ignore. He had seen it before. Sammy was at a crossroads, and if something didn't change, it might break him. Dean sat down next to him, quietly waiting. He had always respected Sammy's fight, but he knew something had to shift. It was time to speak up, but would it be too late? The silence between them was heavy, but finally Dean spoke. "You know, Sammy, I've been watching you fight this battle for years. And I can't pretend to understand it. But I see the pain, the weight you carry. You're one of the most talented men I've ever met, and it pisses me off how the world treats you." Sammy looked at Dean, his eyes full of emotion. It wasn't just the words that struck him, but the sincerity in Dean's voice. Dean, a man who had lived a life of privilege in the industry, was acknowledging something that no one else dared to admit. Sammy's struggle had never been about his talent, but about being accepted for who he was. The world, the industry, and even his own friends often overlooked that. Sammy's throat tightened as he fought back tears. "I don't know how much longer I can do this, Dean," he admitted. "Every night I step on that stage, I feel like I'm not enough. Like no matter how much I give, they'll always see me as less than." Dean placed a hand on Sammy's shoulder, his grip firm, steady. "You're more than enough, Sammy. And maybe it's time I start showing them that too." The words hit Sammy hard, but it was the one thing he needed to hear. The next night, as the Rat Pack gathered backstage at another show, the atmosphere was different. The usual laughter and banter were absent, replaced by a quiet tension. Sammy had always been the heart of the group, his energy and charm lighting up every room he entered. But tonight something had shifted. The weight of the previous conversation with Dean lingered in the air. Sammy had never expected Dean to say those words. It was a rare moment of vulnerability between two men who had always kept their distance from their deepest struggles. But tonight Sammy felt something new, a sense of hope, fragile but present. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was alone. Dean had acknowledged the fight, and in doing so, had given him a glimmer of the support he desperately needed. It was a small step, but it meant the world. Sammy took a deep breath, his nerves settling as he prepared to go on stage. But as he walked toward the spotlight, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that tonight might change everything. Could one word from Dean be enough to open the door to something bigger? The show was in full swing. Frank Sinatra crooned from center stage, his voice smooth as ever. Dean Martin followed with his usual charm, effortlessly playing to the crowd. But it was Sammy Davis Jr. who captivated everyone. His energy was electric, his movements graceful, his voice carrying the weight of all the battles he had fought. But the crowd's applause felt hollow. They loved him, but did they truly understand him? Sammy's performance tonight felt different. He was giving everything, but the sting of rejection was still there, still burning. As he made his way through the routine, his mind kept drifting to the conversation with Dean. Sammy's heart beat faster, the realization growing in his chest. He wasn't just fighting for acceptance anymore. He was fighting for a legacy. This was his moment to claim his place in Hollywood history. But just as quickly, a voice from the audience caught his attention, whispers, subtle but unmistakable, about his race. The sting of prejudice was sharper than ever. Sammy paused, just for a second, but it was enough. He caught Dean's eye from across the stage. There was a quiet understanding between them. This was the moment that could change everything. Dean Martin wasn't one to back down from a challenge, but he wasn't used to confronting it head-on. Tonight, however, the stakes were higher than ever. Sammy had been through so much already, but now Dean felt the pressure to act. It wasn't just about standing by his friend anymore. It was about taking a stand for something larger than both of them. As Sammy sang, Dean's thoughts raced. This moment could either deepen their bond or make it falter forever. He knew Sammy needed more than just support. He needed respect, recognition, and the courage to push back against the silent prejudices that held him back. The crowd's subtle jeers echoed in Dean's mind. He couldn't let this continue, not with Sammy standing on stage, pouring his heart out to a world that still wasn't ready for him. Dean knew he had a choice to make. He could remain the affable entertainer, content with the status quo, or he could step forward and speak the truth that had long been left unspoken. In that moment, as Sammy finished his song, Dean made a decision. The crowd's reaction would be the last straw. He was going to speak up. The moment came unexpectedly. Sammy's final note lingered in the air, and for a moment, everything went silent. Dean, standing at the back of the stage, made his way toward the mic. The crowd's chatter quickly quieted as the spotlight shifted to him. There was an audible tension in the room, a nervous energy that rippled through the audience. Dean Martin, the smooth-talking entertainer, was about to speak. For years, he had played the role of the charming, carefree comedian, the man who never took anything too seriously. But tonight, he wasn't just performing. Sammy's struggles had become his own. Dean's voice was steady but laced with an intensity that caught everyone off guard. "You all love Sammy," he began, his words cutting through the silence. "But that's not enough. It's not enough to just clap and smile. You need to respect him, understand him, and see him for the incredible talent he is." There was a sharpness in his words, a seriousness that was foreign to his usual comedic delivery. Sammy's eyes widened, his breath caught in his chest. This was it. Dean had spoken, and in doing so, had given Sammy the validation he had longed for. But the real impact wasn't just the words, it was the unspoken truth that Dean had chosen to fight for him. The room was still. The audience, stunned by Dean's unexpected words, shifted uncomfortably. Some were taken aback, unsure how to react. But Sammy, standing on stage, felt something inside him shift. It wasn't just the words, it was the unwavering truth behind them. Dean's words had pierced through the facade of politeness that so often masked Hollywood's prejudices. It wasn't just about the applause anymore. Sammy's place in this world wasn't a token gesture, it was earned. The silence that followed Dean's declaration was deafening. Sammy's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of it all threatening to suffocate him. But then, a slow clap started in the back of the room. It wasn't just one person, it was a few, and then more, until the entire room was clapping. Not because they had to, but because they finally understood. Sammy had fought for this moment his entire life, and it was happening. The audience wasn't just clapping for the performance, they were clapping for the man who had never stopped fighting for his right to be seen as equal. Sammy couldn't believe it. This was the moment that changed everything, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked. As the applause echoed through the room, Sammy's emotions came crashing down all at once. He had worked his entire life to get to this point, but now it wasn't just about the fame or the applause, it was about the respect he had finally earned. It was the validation that had been denied him for so long. Sammy couldn't hold back the tears that stung his eyes. Dean was the reason it had happened. His quiet yet powerful stand had shifted the entire atmosphere of the room. The two men locked eyes from across the stage, and in that moment, everything was said without a word. Dean had used his influence to take a stand for Sammy, and the world had listened. But Sammy's victory wasn't just in the applause. It was in the realization that Dean saw him, not just as a performer, but as a person, as an equal. As the clapping slowly died down, Dean stepped forward, his arm around Sammy's shoulders. "You did it, kid," he said quietly. Sammy could only nod, his voice lost in the emotion that overwhelmed him. This wasn't just a win for him, it was a win for every artist who had been told they were less than. Backstage, the mood had shifted dramatically. The Rat Pack, who had always been Sammy's closest friends, surrounded him with a new reverence. They could see the weight that had been lifted from his shoulders, the way he carried himself differently now. Sammy had always been the heart of their group, but now, for the first time, they saw him as not just a talented entertainer, but as an equal. Even Frank Sinatra, who had always been the group's leader, stood quietly in the background, observing. He had witnessed the shift that had occurred, and he knew that Sammy's battle wasn't just for himself. It was for everyone who had ever been overlooked because of the color of their skin. Dean, as always, had been the catalyst, the one to take the first step. The tension that had once lingered in the air was now replaced by something more profound: respect. Sammy, for the first time, didn't feel like he had to prove himself anymore. He wasn't just another performer, he was Sammy Davis Jr., and he had earned his place in history. Dean clapped him on the back, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. "You've earned it, Sammy," he said, the words carrying the weight of a friendship that had withstood the test of time. The crowd's energy lingered long after the show ended, and the mood among the Rat Pack was one of quiet reflection. Sammy stood off to the side, still trying to process what had just happened. He had been a part of this world for so long, but tonight, everything had changed. The respect he had sought for years had finally been given, not through his talent alone, but through the power of a friend who saw him for who he truly was. But even as the cheers faded and the lights dimmed, Sammy couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this single act of courage, had broken a wall that had stood for decades. Dean Martin's decision to publicly stand by him wasn't just an act of friendship. It was a defiance of the system that had kept people like Sammy in the shadows. It was a shift in the power dynamics of Hollywood, and Sammy knew it. He had been a part of history in the making, but the real victory was in the shift that had occurred in the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed it. Sammy was no longer an outsider. He was a force to be reckoned with. The next few days were a whirlwind for Sammy Davis Jr. News of the Rat Pack's historic moment spread quickly through Hollywood. It wasn't just the success of the show that people talked about. It was Dean's bold stand, his refusal to let his friend be sidelined any longer. The media picked up on it, and for the first time, the narrative surrounding Sammy shifted. He wasn't just a novelty, an entertainer with a gimmick, he was an artist who had earned his place. Sammy knew the significance of this moment, but there was still a sense of disbelief. He had spent so long fighting for acceptance, for recognition, and now it felt like the world was finally seeing him as he had always hoped. But with this new visibility came a new pressure. There were those who would see Dean's actions as a betrayal, who would view it as a challenge to the established order. Sammy knew that the battle wasn't over, that the world was still not ready to fully embrace him. But for the first time, he felt as though he could face it. Dean had given him something more than just support. He had given him hope. And that was something Sammy would never take for granted. In the days that followed, Sammy and Dean faced the consequences of their actions. While the audience's applause had been deafening, there were murmurs of discontent behind the scenes. Hollywood, a place built on power dynamics and unspoken rules, was not used to the status quo being challenged. The older, more traditional figures in the industry were uncomfortable with what Dean had done. Some even whispered that the Rat Pack's unity would be forever altered by Dean's bold stance. But Sammy and Dean weren't concerned with the whispers. They had each other, and that was enough. The industry may have been uneasy, but Sammy had just been given a place at the table, a seat among those who had always doubted him. The tension with the powers that be was palpable, but it only made Sammy more determined. It didn't matter what they said behind closed doors, Sammy knew he had won something far more valuable than any contract or deal. He had won respect. And respect, in Hollywood, was everything. As the weeks passed, the aftermath of that night began to settle. The public's view of Sammy Davis Jr. had irrevocably changed. The spotlight was no longer just on his talent, it was on his character, his perseverance, and his fight for equality. The Rat Pack, too, underwent a subtle transformation. They were no longer just a group of entertainers. They were symbols of a moment in history that would never be forgotten. But as the world embraced Sammy's success, there was still an undercurrent of tension. Hollywood was never going to fully accept someone who didn't fit their mold, but Sammy had never been one to conform. Dean's support had given him the courage to keep fighting, but Sammy knew that his journey wasn't over. There would always be obstacles, always be those who would try to tear him down. But now, he had the strength to face them. Sammy had proven that one word, one simple act of courage, could change everything. And he wasn't going to let anyone take that from him. In private moments, away from the glare of the media, Sammy and Dean often found themselves reflecting on what had happened. It wasn't just about the show, the applause, or the accolades. It was about the bond they had shared, one that had deepened in ways either of them had expected. Sammy often found himself wondering if Dean knew just how much that moment had meant to him. It wasn't just about the fight for acceptance. It was about the friendship, the trust, and the understanding that had always existed between them. They had never needed words to express their loyalty to each other, but that one act of defiance had spoken volumes. "You didn't have to do it, Dean," Sammy once said quietly. Dean just shrugged, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I know you," he replied simply. "I wasn't about to let the world keep you down. Not while I'm around." It wasn't a grand speech, it was just the kind of thing Dean had always said. And for Sammy, it was everything. In that moment, he realized that this friendship, this support, was the greatest gift he had ever received. And it would stay with him for the rest of his life. As the years passed, Sammy Davis Jr.'s legacy continued to grow, solidified by that pivotal moment with Dean Martin. Hollywood, though slow to change, began to see him not just as a performer but as a trailblazer. Sammy's career flourished in ways he had never imagined, and with each new success he carried with him the quiet strength of that night. The industry had always been a battlefield, but now, Sammy was on the front lines, leading the charge for change. Yet, it wasn't just his career that had changed, it was the very fabric of his identity. That night with Dean had given him more than validation. It had given him the strength to live authentically, to step into a world that wasn't ready for him and demand his place. Sammy and Dean's friendship, a bond forged through shared struggles and mutual respect, became legendary. It wasn't just a Hollywood story, it was a story of resilience, courage, and unwavering loyalty. Sammy had always been a fighter, but now, the world saw him as a champion. And in every performance, in every word he spoke, he carried the legacy of that moment, a moment that would echo through Hollywood history. As the story of that night spread, it became more than just a piece of Hollywood gossip. It was a turning point, a moment that would be remembered for generations. Sammy Davis Jr. wasn't just a star, he was a symbol of perseverance, of breaking barriers, and of the quiet power of one word, one act of courage. The story of Dean's stand for Sammy became a legend, passed down through the years as a testament to what true friendship could accomplish. It wasn't just about fame or fortune, it was about human dignity, and the willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Sammy, in his quiet, powerful way, had changed Hollywood forever. And Dean, through his simple but profound act of support, had helped him do it. The legacy of that night lives on in the hearts of all those who fight for what they believe in. The Rat Pack's bond, once just a symbol of friendship and entertainment, became something far greater, a legacy of courage, loyalty, and equality. Sammy Davis Jr. and Dean Martin had not just changed Hollywood, they had changed the world. This story reminds us that sometimes, all it takes is one act of courage to change everything. Sammy Davis Jr. and Dean Martin's friendship is a lesson in loyalty, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right. What moment in your life has defined who you are? Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.